In the late summer of 1943, the German war machine on the Eastern Front was no longer advancing. It was bleeding. The catastrophic failure of their great offensive at Kursk had shattered the spine of the Panzerwaffe and handed the strategic initiative permanently to the Soviet Red Army. Across a 2,000-mile front, from the swamps of the north to the Black Sea in the south, the once invincible Wehrmacht was in a desperate, fighting retreat. But Hitler had one last fortress, one final line he believed would stop the Red Tide and save his crumbling empire. It was a massive natural barrier that snaked its way through the heart of Ukraine, the Dnieper River. The Dnieper was one of the largest rivers in Europe, a wide, formidable obstacle that the German High Command intended to turn into an Eastern Wall, or Ostwall. They would fortify the high western bank, turning it into an impregnable line of machine guns, artillery, and bunkers. They were confident that the exhausted Red Army would be forced to halt, giving Germany the entire winter to rest, regroup, and stabilize the front. What they didn't count on was the iron will of one man, Joseph Stalin. From the Kremlin, Stalin issued a terrifyingly simple order to his generals. The Dnieper was to be crossed immediately, off the march, without pausing to bring up heavy artillery or proper bridging equipment. What followed was one of the single bloodiest and most desperate operations of the entire war. It was a battle fought not with brilliant tactics, but with raw courage and an almost incomprehensible disregard for human life. It was a battle fought by men who were ordered to swim a river under a storm of machine gun fire, clinging to logs, makeshift rafts, and the bodies of their fallen comrades. This is the hidden story of the Battle of the Dnieper and the suicide swimmers who broke Hitler's Eastern Wall. The German retreat to the Dnieper was a scorched earth campaign. As they fell back through the rich agricultural lands of Ukraine, they destroyed everything. They burned villages, tore up railway lines, and slaughtered livestock, determined to leave nothing for the advancing Soviets but a barren wasteland. Their goal was to buy time to construct the Eastern Wall. The western bank of the Dnieper, which was significantly higher and steeper than the eastern bank in most places, was a perfect natural defensive position. German engineers worked furiously to enhance it, digging trench systems, building concrete pillboxes, and sighting artillery to command every possible crossing point. The German soldiers who manned these positions, though weary from the retreat, felt a renewed sense of security. The river was their shield. They believed no army could force a crossing against such defenses. On the other side, the Red Army was exhausted. They had been advancing for months. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and their units had taken heavy casualties. But they were driven forward by a relentless momentum and the ruthless orders coming from Stavka, the Soviet High Command. Stalin knew that if he gave the Germans time to properly fortify the Dnieper, breaking through would cost millions of lives later. He decided to pay the price in blood now. The order was given to force the river at any and all points, as quickly as possible. The first units to establish a bridgehead on the western bank would be richly rewarded. The title Hero of the Soviet Union was promised to any soldier who distinguished himself in the crossing. In late September 1943, the first Soviet units reached the eastern bank. What they saw was a daunting sight. The river was hundreds of yards wide, the current was swift, and the far bank was a high, fortified cliff spitting machine gun fire. They had almost no proper assault boats. The heavy pontoon bridging equipment was still hundreds of miles behind them, struggling to catch up on the destroyed roads. A conventional, prepared river crossing was out of the question. So they improvised. What happened next was a series of desperate, almost suicidal acts of bravery across a 400-mile front. Under the cover of darkness, small groups of Soviet soldiers would gather on the riverbank. They used anything that could float. They lashed together logs to make crude rafts. They commandeered small fishing boats from local villagers. They used empty oil barrels and wooden doors ripped from shattered houses. Many had nothing at all. They would simply strip off their gear, wrap their rifle and ammunition in a ground sheet to keep it dry, and slip into the freezing cold water, intending to swim across. The crossings were a slaughter. The Germans had searchlights sweeping the river. Their machine guns, sighted on the high ground, created deadly interlocking fields of fire. The moment a raft or a group of swimmers was spotted, the water would erupt in a spray of bullets. Men were killed in the water, their bodies drifting silently downstream. Rafts were torn apart, tipping their occupants into the cold current. Many who were not hit by bullets simply drowned, their exhausted bodies giving out halfway across. A Soviet soldier later described the scene. The water was not water. It was a porridge of mud, blood, and bodies. We pushed off on our raft made of 2 logs. The Germans saw us. The man next to me was hit in the head and fell into the river without a sound. The logs came apart. I clung to one, my rifle in my other hand. The only thing I could think was, forward, forward, forward. Against all odds, some of them made it. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes no more than a dozen men, would crawl out of the river onto the western bank, shivering, exhausted, and often with only the ammunition they could carry. They had established a bridgehead, but a bridgehead was just a tiny, precarious foothold on enemy soil. The moment they were discovered, the Germans would throw everything they had at them to wipe them out. These small groups would dig frantically into the mud and clay of the riverbank, creating shallow foxholes. They would fight off German counterattacks with grenades and rifles, often for days completely cut off. Their only hope was that more men could get across to reinforce them and that the engineers could somehow get a bridge built. The story repeated itself all along the Dnieper. At one crossing point, a company of soldiers swam across at night, each man holding onto a single plank of wood. Only 60 out of 120 made it to the other side. They immediately stormed a German trench, fighting with bayonets and sharpened shovels, and managed to hold a tiny patch of ground. For 48 hours, they fought off repeated German attacks until reinforcements arrived. The sheer ferocity and seeming disregard for their own lives stunned the German defenders. They could not understand what kind of soldier would willingly swim into a wall of machine gun fire. They were facing an enemy whose determination to advance was absolute, an enemy for whom catastrophic casualties were simply the accepted price of victory. Slowly, painfully, these tiny, bloody bridgeheads began to expand. Under the cover of these desperate firefights, Soviet engineers performed miracles. They worked in the river, often under direct artillery fire, to construct pontoon bridges. The moment a bridge was completed, the dynamic of the battle would change. Soviet T-34 tanks, heavy artillery, and fresh infantry would pour across, solidifying the bridgehead and beginning the breakout. By the end of October, the Red Army had established over 20 bridgeheads on the western bank of the Dnieper. The impenetrable eastern wall had been breached, not by a single powerful hammer blow, but by 1,000 tiny, bloody cuts. The final push came in November. From a large bridgehead south of Kiev, General Nikolai Vatutin's First Ukrainian Front launched a massive armored offensive. Using a brilliant deception plan, they tricked the Germans into expecting an attack from the south of the city. Instead, they secretly moved their tank armies north of Kiev, crossed the river, and smashed into the German flank. The German defenders were caught completely by surprise. On November 6, 1943, the city of Kiev, the third largest in the Soviet Union, was liberated. The Battle of the Dnieper was one of the largest and costliest battles in human history. The exact casualties are still debated, but it is estimated that the total losses for both sides, killed and wounded, were well over 1.5 million men. The Red Army may have suffered over 1 million of those casualties themselves. The price for crossing the river was astronomical, but for the Soviet Union it was a price worth paying. They had broken through Hitler's last major defensive line in the east. They had liberated a huge swathe of their own territory and a major capital city. And they had proven that no river, no fortress, no wall could stop the Red Army's advance. The road to Berlin was now open. The story of the Dnieper crossing is a brutal testament to the nature of the war on the Eastern Front. It was a conflict waged on a scale and with a ferocity that is almost impossible to comprehend. The suicide swimmers, who threw themselves into the river, were the embodiment of the Soviet war effort. They were ordinary men, farmers, and factory workers, who were called upon to do the impossible. They were driven by a mixture of patriotism, hatred for the German invaders, and the ruthless discipline of the Soviet regime. They knew that to hesitate meant being shot by their own officers, but to advance meant a likely death from the enemy. And so they chose to advance. Their incredible, desperate bravery, multiplied by the hundreds of thousands, was the secret weapon that broke Hitler's Eastern Wall. It was a victory written in the blood of countless unknown soldiers, whose bodies washed away down the cold, dark waters of the Dnieper River.